You are amazing. Did you know that you are so amazing that if your brain was a computer, currently the fastest supercomputer would do about 0.002% of the calculations your brain can do? Not my brain, but maybe your brain. Somebody's brain is out there acting that fast. You know, you're so amazing that you are the best. I'm sorry, this one is not acting right. It's driving. You are such an amazing long-distance runner that some of our ancestors, thousands of years ago, employed a hunting method where they would simply chase an animal until it fell down and died. You are better than all of the four-footed, all the other creatures. As a species, again, not me, but as a species, I'd be hungry. As a species, we are amazing long-distance runners. Your fingers are so sensitive that if your fingertip was the size of the earth, you could tell the difference between a house and a car. That's how amazing your fingers are at sensing things. And your tears, depending on why you cry, you make a different tear. If they look at your tear underneath a microscope, and they have a tear from when you were grieving, and one from when you were hoping, and one from when you were cutting onions, they look different. You don't even think about that. And your body is doing all this amazing stuff. That's how incredible you are. It's wonderful how God made you. Today we had the reading of the talents. It's a text that many of us have heard before. You probably know the rhythm of how this text works. The first servant comes back. He's been given 5 talents. He comes back with 10 talents. And God says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." The next servant comes back. He's been given 2 talents. He comes back with 4 talents. And God, or the master says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." The servant that's been given 1 talent comes back with 1 talent. And the master says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." No. You're supposed to correct me. I thought you were listening. You've been busted. You weren't listening. So the final servant, right, something has gone very wrong with the talent. Now maybe something went right because the master gave the servants talents based on their ability, and we noticed the last servant only got 1 talent. And so maybe the master kind of knew in advance, this could be a teachable moment in a different way for this servant, but something went very wrong. Progress reports went out this week. Yeah, I'm lucky. We didn't have to have the kind of discussion at home that the master's having with this service discussion. Hopefully nobody has to have that kind of discussion. But the discussion the master has with this servant with the 1 talent is not a happy one, is it? And that servant, well, it's kind of shameful, right? He comes back, and instead of owning it, he throws all the blame on the master. Well, it's all because you're terrible. You're just such a terrible master. I had no choice. I had to bury the money to protect all of us from your awfulness. Perception. He has a perception of his master, and he's decided to let that guide his actions. Yes? So flip that around. The other 2 servants, how did they perceive their master? What would they be perceiving? Not the awfulness, right? That's not what's in their head, apparently, if we look at their productivity. Maybe empowerment. Maybe they saw this person as one who empowers others because as a slave or a servant, maybe they didn't have anything of their own, and now this person's given them something to go out into the world and make something with it. They perceive this master as one who recognizes the gifts inside of them and calls those gifts forth, that they can excel at what they're really good at. I'm assuming there was lots of servants. We only have these 3. Now, it is a story, and we do have to remember, it's a teaching story, so things are made a little more clear-cut than life really is. They might see this master as one who encourages risk-taking. Maybe this master is okay with taking a few risks. Maybe this master is one who encourages creativity. It's a whole new life, right? If all we had was the story of the last servant, the one-talent servant, if that's the only image you have of this master, would you ever want to be in that household? So one lesson maybe Jesus is sharing is how we perceive, also how we share with others, shapes their perception of who we're following. How do we talk about this church, or our God, or ourselves, or each other? You may know those people that when you run into them, it's always like talking to the one-talent servant. That gets to be an old conversation after a while. We all go there from time to time. George Bernard Shaw says, "A life spent making mistakes is not only one honorable, but more useful than a life spent doing nothing." This is a teaching story, so it's very easy to follow the straight line. I got 5, I made 10, I had 2, I made 4. Life's not like that every day, right? But what if we were known more for perceiving and sharing the way that those first 2 servants perceived and saw, than, by the way, the number 1 talent servant did? And maybe that's what Jesus is trying to share. Because in Jesus' understanding of God, it is more like the first 2. Think back to the sermon we had last week. You were all listening, right? I remember a little bit of it. So Paul is trying to encourage us to go for the greater gifts, and Paul says that the greater gifts are love. I think by implication, because the very next thing he writes about is all this stuff about how awesome love is. So if love is the greatest gift, which would be confirmed by things Jesus said, where Jesus says, love your neighbor, love your God. If those are the greater gifts, and we look at the text today as the master being God and us being the servants, and we're being given stuff to work with, and if one of the greatest things we're given to work with is love, how does the story play out? How is your world if you were given 5 units of love and you turn that into 10 units of love? How does your world look? Versus if you were given 1 unit of love and you dug a hole and you buried it. How does your world look? If you buried your unit of love in the ground to safeguard it, what would be your experience of the world around you? But if we're following God as known by the other 2 servants, and we start to invest our love in the marketplace, in our community, in our church, in our neighbor, in our loved ones, that's how we get 10 units. That's how we see things multiply, when we make that kind of investment. We're blessed as a tradition that Alexander Campbell was one among us, helped found our movement by spending his life so well. Campbell was an Irish immigrant, educated in Scotland, came over to America in the early 1800s with his family. As a leader on the frontier, he encouraged our movement to be very much about the power of the Bible in your life, the authority of Scripture, but also the responsibility for the individual to read it and to interpret it and to use it. A lot about congregational autonomy. So many gifts he gave us. He was an amazing man. He definitely had more than 24 hours in a day, because he was editing a magazine, founding a college that still exists, addressing Congress, being nationally known for his debating power with other ministers. I don't know how you get all that done. But in addition to all of that, he was living out. He was spending his life as he was preaching. When his first child was born, the tradition in his family and the families around him for generations had been infant baptism. But he'd been preaching about the power of Scripture and interpreting Scripture, so when his first child was born, he and his wife studied the Bible to discern what would be the way for their children. And they decided to wait and to do an immersion baptism when their child was older. I grew up in this tradition. I went to seminary. I was trained in this tradition. Immersion baptism is sort of a theological concept that just makes so much sense to me. While I affirm all methods of baptism, that one just works for me. But I know what it's like when you have something that you think works for you up here, and then you apply it in your life and take the risk. When you wait to baptize your child and let them make the choice, that's taking a risk. That's taking your faith. That's one of the many ways in which we can take our faith and apply it in our life and trust that God is going to work a miracle. That's spending our life well. That's spending our life as if it's a gift given to us. When we teach Christian stewardship, one of the foundational tenets is that we own nothing. That in truth, everything is God's. God created it to begin with. God takes care of it in ways that we can't imagine. We don't own things. God owns things. We're simply the stewards. God gives us the opportunity to be a steward of stuff, of relationships, of time. And then God asks us to be good about that, to be Christian about that. We spend our life not because we own it, but because we have the opportunity to use it to make a difference. To make a difference in the world we live in. We can bury our unit of love if we want. It's our choice. And some days, that feels like the right choice, because life just roughs us up. But if we'll take the risk, endure a bit of pain every now and then when life does rough us up, and start sharing that. 10 units of love, that's an amazing place to be. And I hope we are all there tomorrow and every day. I get to